Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for registering for our 2021 Racial Justice Series. As mentioned, my name is Sherman Henry, faculty member of the University of Oregon Labor Education and Research Center, better known as LERC. I want to acknowledge all of my LERC colleagues and community with us this afternoon. I want to introduce our presenter speaker, Dr. Sarah Kooten. Sarah is the Director of Student Services for the University of Oregon, Portland campus, and chairperson of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, which I serve under her leadership. Sarah was born and raised in Oregon and her lived experience has many lessons that shaped her identity and work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sarah has experienced international locations like Southeast Asia and West Africa that informs her lived experience and research. This evening, Sarah will provide us with a framework from her research on adulting while Black. And together we will discuss how identity shapes our space and explore meaning through intercultural competencies in the workplace. We would examine ways in which we can strengthen unions and improve our cultural relationships by examining research on the identities in society, higher education, and expand it to the workforce for working while Black. But this does not necessarily limit us to just Black. This is really all stakeholders in creating a great society. The theoretical framework would allow us to discuss related issues to the workforce, higher ed, and how we experience the world. My colleague, Jennifer Smith, will provide some additional instructions on the process and the ways we want you to participate in today's event and discussion, after which we will hear from Sarah as our event speaker. Thank you. Jennifer.
Hi all, thanks so much for joining us. Today we'll just stay muted, just typical Zoom norms. We'll use chat for questions and comments, and I'll be monitoring that and drawing Dr. Cooten's attention to those as they come in. And there'll be time for discussion too, where if you prefer to raise your hand and ask your own questions, so we'd be happy to do that as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to our guest, Dr. Sarah Kooten. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. I am so happy to see some friendly faces and names on the Zoom. That always is reassuring to me. So I'm really glad to have this conversation today. Special thanks to Sherman, Henry, and Lurk for offering me this platform to share this research that I'm incredibly passionate about. So let's go ahead and get started. Here is a quick overview of how we're going to spend our time together today. Now, this presentation is in large part based on my dissertation research. And my research explored the experiences that Black students have while in college and how those experiences shape their adult identity development. And as I begun to share my research with broader audiences, it's become clear that the findings of my work have application and transferability to other settings. And so Sherman has been kind of involved with my dissertation process along the way, and we've been talking about these parallels for a while. So I'm really excited to have this conversation this evening with you about these findings and extrapolating that to the workplace. So like I said, my initial conversation with you, the data that I'm going to be sharing is based on Black college students, but I want to challenge all of us to think about how this might transfer. And I'm excited to engage in that conversation with you. Think about how does showing up and being Black look like in the workplace, given workplace culture, norms, leadership models, the practices, the expectations that we have for each other in the workplace. And then how does that shape how Black folks view themselves and how they navigate those spaces? So that's where we're going. I'll start by introducing the problem that I identified in higher education, and then we'll situate that problem within the scholarly literature, a lot of the research that has been going on about this topic. And then the piece that I love to share with folks is the lived experiences of the students that I interviewed as a part of my dissertation research. And that is where this model that I'm going to share with you really comes alive. And I think we'll be able to see those interconnections between college campus experiences and workplace experiences that folks may have. And then finally, I'll close out with a discussion about what this means, what we can do with this information, how we press forward, right? And we'll have opportunities to kind of dig deeper into a Q&A in that time. Throughout the presentation, I'll have slides with prompting us to like take a moment to take a breath, to reflect, to have folks be able to unmute themselves and share thoughts or feedback at that time. And also throughout the presentation, I hope that the chat box will be a place where you can connect with each other. I really see this space as a learning community. I want to draw from the wisdom of each of you in this room based on your experiences and your knowledge and your expertise. I believe I'm the expert on adulting while Black, but you are all experts in your own experiences. And so I want to honor that in this space. So please, please, please use the chat box. I actually cannot see it because I've got too many other things on my screen. So thank you, Jennifer, for monitoring that. But you're welcome to use that space. All righty, now to the nitty gritty. So in higher education, we have long known that there's an inextricable link between identity development and student success. And we have spent a lot of time putting resources and energy into harnessing that relationship between the development of adult identity and student achievement, right? And scholars have found that by helping students cultivate their adult identity through this optimal balance of challenge and support, that students become more engaged and active in their learning, which can lead toward, greater satisfaction in their college experience and ultimately graduation. As such, we have a ton of programs, resources, and policies to help support this developmental context. Among the traditional age crowd, the concept of adulting has become an important identity construct to define what it means to transition from adolescence to adulthood. So many of you may have heard of adulting before, but I had to go to Urban Dictionary, which is the ultimate pop culture resource for figuring out what young people are talking about these days, to define adulting for officially, right? So adulting is defined as to do grown-up things and hold responsibilities such as a 9-to-5 job, pay a mortgage or rent, or anything else that makes one think of grown-ups. But the process of adulting doesn't look the same for all people. There is a long understood colloquialism among Black Americans that doing practically anything while Black in America connotes the social idea that all Black people at any given time are assumed to be engaging in unlawful or suspicious behavior. In 2018, CNN covered 26 news stories, that's one at least every other week, in which Black people made international news while being accosted, humiliated, and made to feel unsafe for living while Black in America. Now, on this list on your screen, there are some scenarios where folks seem to be engaged in suspicious behavior simply by showing up to work as a firefighter, right? Working as a firefighter, working as a home inspector are some of the things that are on this list before you. And the realities of racism and these inequities also extend to the higher education environment as well. So in 2018, the Race and Equity Center at USC published a 50-state report card that assessed American public colleges and universities based on their support for Black student success. They used metrics such as the representation of Black students and Black faculty, the balance of Black male and Black female students, as well as graduation rates of Black students in comparison to their white peers. Now, based on the findings of this report, the authors concluded that American public colleges and universities are failing Black students. And so I want us to think about, what does this mean for the workplace? What does this mean for the pipeline to the folks that go into, are entering the workforce? Not just from college, but through apprenticeship programs, other different trades, things like that. What does this mean, right? If there is not this representation there. Now, we know that supporting adult identity can improve student success outcomes, but what happens when the social realities of Black students are vastly different to those of their white peers, right? How might racism lead to Black students feeling unsafe on campus? And what does that mean for their college experience and this very critical development that's happening during this time? So I want you to meet Lolade Sinyambola. Last year, or this was actually a few years ago now, Lolade was a graduate student at Yale, and was working on a paper in her residence hall common area. And like most exhausted students do, and many of us, frankly, they get to a stopping point, and she decided that she wanted to take a nap on the couch, right? And while she rested, a white student noticed that she was sleeping in this common area and decided that she didn't belong there, right? And determined that the best plan of action would be to call the campus police to intervene. So minutes later, Lolade woke up to find herself surrounded by police officers who demanded that she prove why she was taking a nap in this residence hall when she actually like lived there, right? And after about 15 minutes, the officers determined that she was a student at the university and said, okay, never mind, sorry about that, and left, right? Now, what we often don't hear about is what happens next for students like Lolade who are harmed by these racist acts on campus. You know, how did this incident impact her socially and psychologically? You know, again, how might it make her feel unsafe at Yale and unwelcome at Yale, right? And ultimately, what did this teach her about being Black, a Black woman in higher education and in America? You know, racism is an injustice that permeates the fabric of American life today. Today's Black college students, like generations before them, are confronted with messaging and behavior that the color of their skin means that they do not belong, that their lives do not matter, and that white supremacy remains a constant threat in their lives. So adulting and adulting while Black are two very different constructs. If we are to support Black students' adult identity development toward their success in college, we must be attentive to the ways in which racism is part of that developmental process. So while as I said, I may be initially talking about the experiences of Black college students, I also want to remind us to challenge ourselves to think broadly about what this might also look like in the workplace. What does it mean to support the success of Black employees? And how does the affirmation and respect of their identity contribute to organizational success? And so feel free to use the chat box with any thoughts that you may have as kind of we're going along here. So as noted in my introduction, identity and student success are strongly connected. The development of self-authorship is a concept that has risen to the top as a developmental learning outcome in higher education because it has implications for how students engage and collaborate with each other, their critical thinking and problem-solving skills, and their self-efficacy in college and beyond. So we are trying in higher ed to help students move toward this autonomous way of thinking and being so that they can be really productive in the workplace. And so self-authorship represents this psychological and social transformation to what I'm calling true adulting, which is perhaps more compelling of a marker of adulthood than like learning how to load a dishwasher or balance a checkbook or something like that. That they are like psychologically an adult beyond just doing things, but they have embodied what it means to be an adult. Really quickly, I want to show you this model of self-authorship because it's going to come into play in just a moment. So self-authorship has these three dimensions. Those are those circles on your screen: the interpersonal, epistemological, and intrapersonal. And each of those dimensions is associated with a specific question that we ask students to kind of help understand where they are in this model towards self-authorship. So folks who are in external formulas stage are those that if I was to ask a student, like, you know, what kind of, you know, how do you know that, that, I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm fumbling here for a moment, but I guess a student in external formulas will often explain their worldview from the perspective of other people. So the reason they know things is because their teachers told them or their parents told them. Versus a person self-authoring will say, well, I have had experience in this. I've like looked at a lot of different perspectives. And so I have this personally grounded perspective on X, Y, Z. And that's really where we're trying to move folks so that they are more autonomous in their thinking. I should also note that I'm a critical race scholar. And so part of my research was deconstructing the original model of self-authorship to understand how those questions might shift if we were thinking about the social realities of people of color. And so I worked from a model of critical race self-authorship. So instead of asking students, how do they know something? It's like, how do I make meaning of my social world? So we're really bringing in the impacts of racism on their lived experiences. And this will come into play a little bit. I don't want to dig too deep into this. So to help us
ask a question out of the chat that I think applies to that last slide. Someone is asking in the chat, how is self-authorship related to self-efficacy? Are they related concepts? Is that kind of like, how do you know how you're making an impact on the world, or self-confidence? What is that like?
Yeah, I would say self-authorship is really about your internal sense of kind of how you view the world, and self-efficacy is like the practice of that, right? How am I able to take my understanding of myself and the people around me and the relationships that I want and how I see the world, and what does that mean in how I'm able to then navigate the world? If somebody has the idea that they aren't necessarily in control of their life, and their choices, they're not going to be as self-efficacious, is that the word, in their practice. If that makes sense.
Yes.
All righty, thank you for that question. And we are about to, in just a couple slides here, have a break for additional discussion questions. But I want you to meet and learn a little bit more about the participants that I engaged with as part of my study. So all of the participants that I interviewed for my dissertation research identified as Black or African American. You can see kind of how they define themselves on the screen here. And they ranged in age from 19 to 26 years old. They came from various parts of the United States and the world. And it's also important to note that their Black identities also intersected with the other social identities that included gender, sexual orientation, and their racial makeup, right? More than half of the participants were first generation students. That's meaning that they're the first in their family to attend and be on track to complete college. And more than half of them lived on campus at some point in their career. And then also 7 of these participants also moved to the institution that I studied at some point in their college career. So this was their second or third, it's in some cases their fourth institution that they had attended. So we're really as a mix of folks and experiences in higher education. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the dimensions of self-authorship and what came out of that. So the first dimension that I want to talk about is this interpersonal dimension. And this is where we start asking students, what relationships do you want with others for the benefit of your social world? And the interviews really yielded very interesting findings with regard to how Black students made meaning of their experiences on a historically white college campus. So the key finding here was that the participants were aware of the fact that not all of their relationships were to benefit their social world, and instead that they needed to be intentional about who they interacted with and how. So microaggressions, which are like these kind of subtle racist aggressions and acts, were frequent on campus. And so this meant that the students needed to be keen to understand white supremacy and kind of weighing whether or not they needed to kind of push back or just kind of let things slide. So there was this constant need to pick their battles. And one student explained that typically with white people, it's like I'm the only person and I'm going to have to call out racism in front of a whole bunch of other people. But there's this horrible fact within me that white people hold power. Therefore, I cannot burn this bridge. It's a really shitty, ugly thing. So there's this constant need to kind of assess when it was safe or necessary to interrupt oppression when it happened to them. And that added a lot of weight and anxiety for them. For Black students, they often sought connections with other Black faculty and staff on campus to buffer against the racism that they experience. So these folks really help them make meaning, decompress, were outlets for them to vent their frustrations. And so these relationships with other Black folks on campus serve to benefit their social world and help them persist in a racially hostile climate. The epistemological dimension of self-authorship asks, how do I make meaning of my social world? And in this dimension, the participants felt pressured to represent the Black race when faced with negative stereotypes. So as Nia explains, I'm always scared of saying something that makes white people look down on me, and then that translates to them looking down at other people like me. And so being a minority and having Black status made me want to prove myself in every situation so that it's easier for other people to come after me to be able to do the same. And what I thought was really powerful about what Nia had to say was that there was this very strong collective identity that she had to her race, right? And so, and a lot of that added a lot of pressure as well to kind of always be the perfect upstanding example. Like it wasn't enough, and I heard this again and again from the participants, that it wasn't enough to be average. You were expected to go above and beyond just to be seen as average amongst their white peers. The interpersonal dimension of self-authorship asks Black students, how does your social world shape your sense of self as a racialized being? And the findings in this dimension suggest that like how one grew up in their connection to their Black identity growing up has a major influence on their sense of self. And this is one of the critical things that came out of my research was these two terms, Black intrinsic socialization and Black emergent socialization. So those with Black intrinsic socialization interacted with the college environment by making meaning of where it was safe for them to be authentically Black. They described having to be two different people in order to be successful. For those familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, this is this idea that they needed to kind of switch their personality and their codes, their social codes, in order to navigate the environment. So these folks often needed to code switch to kind of meet the white expectations of them on campus. And in the classroom, they felt that they couldn't be their full selves. And it also meant that they wouldn't fully engage in their learning, right? So when we think about this in the workplace, what does it mean to not be able to be your whole self in the workplace? What does it mean to not be able to kind of ask the questions and bring your purpose and energy into the space, right? How does that impact productivity? Those with Black emergent socialization needed to do more reflection about the roots of their perhaps the term I use is low racial salience. So meaning that means that they were not as tied as closely to their Black identity. They kind of they had other pieces of who they are that were perhaps more important than their race from time to time. And so their time in college, when their Blackness kind of became front and center for them through the experiences that they had, challenged them, and they needed to kind of reflect on why race wasn't as important for them growing up. And college was a time for them specifically to unpack some of the trauma that may have been involved with that. And often this was done with other Black students, faculty, and staff. So I am going to take a pause here as I can't see the chat, and I hope that there's lots of discussion happening in there, and ask a couple questions of this group just to kind of get the conversation going, but also if there are additional questions, we can move forward with that as well. So I'm wondering for folks, do these findings or things that I'm sharing right now relate or not to your own experiences, either in the workplace or in higher education? And do you navigate the world in this way where you kind of have to put on a different face, a different persona in order to, when you go to work, to be successful, to be able to navigate conversations and things like that? And you're welcome to unmute yourself to talk.
I would say as a white person who I do have a sense of being multidimensional and bringing forward different dimensions of myself in the workplace versus, you know, my home life. And it can be really stressful. And I feel like not only do my Black colleagues may have not only that, you know, the professional self, you know, the collegial self and the private self, and that's stressful enough. But then there's like all these other dimensions too that they're having to navigate that you just discussed in those slides. And it seems like an incredible burden and probably adds a lot of stress to what is already a stressful experience, being a worker and a mother and all these other dimensions of being a person. There is a comment in the chat, two comments. One, Johanna says, most definitely. I was raised in the South and went to a PWI for undergraduate and graduate studies. I can relate to the double consciousness. What is a PWI for those who don't know?
Yeah, so that's oh, you can go, Jonna, if you want to.
Oh, sure. Primarily white institution.
Aha, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I will often, I switch between saying primarily white institution and historically white institution, because we have seen that institutions have begun to enroll more folks from underrepresented racial groups, but the policies and the practices are still very much embedded in white culture and white norms. And so I want to capture that just because we have more diversity doesn't necessarily mean that those problems go away for Black students or students from underrepresented backgrounds.
Kind of referencing back to maybe a previous slide, Sherman made an observation that is really salient now, I think, in terms of voting rights, where he says, when we think of the recent general elections, Black voters have been labeled as engaging in illegal voter registration. Racism has influenced public policy and practice in just normal activities that create different rights and assumptions that Black citizens experience in society. So just trying to behave as a regular citizen then becomes loaded with illegality.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for drawing that parallel for us. Any other thoughts?
One more, yeah. Well, Marquisha says, yes, it resonates with her also. She says, I frequently find myself exhausted from having to navigate the landmines. I had to do it in school and now as a professional.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that. And I also want to be mindful for the folks, the Black folks in the room, that I also don't want to make you feel like you need to be put on the spot to share your lived experience if you don't feel comfortable. So that is it is share as you are comfortable, but also I also recognize that it can be traumatic to put that information out there, particularly in a public type of conversation like this. I should have said that early on, but I appreciate any insights that folks can share. So thank you. All right, let's go ahead and continue on here. Slide. There we go. So I'm going to do a little bit more theory here to provide some context for the next pieces that I'm going to share with you. So nigrescence is a French term that translates to the process of becoming Black. And it is a term that William Cross Jr. developed in the 1970s. And it assumes that Black identity is informed by the racism that Black folks experience and how they navigate the meaning of those experiences over time. So like self-authorship, nigrescence is a stage-based model. And in 1994, he cross-partnered with another scholar to kind of map this out over the lifetime, starting from infancy to end of life. And so it's really fascinating to see kind of what happens and how people inform their Black racial identity throughout that lifespan. But the things that I want you to be most to note here and will become clear in a moment is Cross also describes 4 adult Black identity types, which I'm going to show you in a moment. But these include internalized racism, multicultural Black identity, bicultural Black identity, and Black nationalist identity. And so in order to kind of marry this idea of adulting with Black racial identity, I needed to combine self-authorship and nigrescence into kind of this model. So what I'm about to share with you is associated with Black racial identity formation model that I developed with my research, which is here on your screen. And I'm not going to get too deep into the nitty gritty of this model right now, because I think that the examples that I'm about to share are going to help bring it to life in a way that's going to be a little bit more memorable and meaningful for folks. But essentially, the model describes the ways in which Black students encounter in the campus environment, and how they make meaning of those encounters, and how those encounters manifest in how they behave on campus and express themselves on campus. So from a developmental perspective, encounters are a way to explain how something happens to a person that challenges them to reflect on their identity. So for an example, pretty much every Black American can tell you about the first time they were called the N-word. And for many, that moment or series of moments impacted them deeply. It may have caused them confusion, frustration, anger, sadness, and more. But ultimately, that encounter forced them into a reflection process about what it means to be Black. So similarly, I assert in my dissertation that coming to college is an encounter for Black students because they are introduced into a new environment that has historically been designed to support the needs and interests of upper middle class white folks. Now, this is not to say that white students don't also have to navigate the newness of college, but there's an additional racialized layer for Black students, and this complicates things for them. And it involves a level of emotional labor that white students aren't necessarily experiencing as they're going to college. So what I want you to think about then as we think about the workplace is going to work an encounter for Black folks. And where might that be most evident, right? What is it about the workplace or the people that makes going to work remind a Black person that they are Black? And that is not necessarily a good thing if we are to think about the while Black phenomenon, right? What does that messaging look like? What are those experiences? Because we spend so much time at work, it can be extremely disenfranchising for folks to constantly have that experience of racism through microaggressions or treatment or practices. It impacts the entire body, the mind, soul, and the spirit of folks. And when we're doing that, we're not allowing people to flourish and be their best selves and most productive in the workplace. So I'm going to talk about some of the folks in my study and how they encountered in their experiences on this college campus and how they managed those experiences. And as I'm going through these, I want you to think about yourself or other people that you know and how they might fit within these different groups. And this is where these negrescence adult identity types are going to come in. So I want you to meet Hazel. And Hazel, for my study, I put her into the category of an internalized racism profile within the negrescence model. So the internalized racism type describes an individual who, due to socialization or adverse experiences, distances themselves from Black identity and culture. And so I'm going to draw from Hazel's experiences for this piece. Hazel grew up in a rural, predominantly white town in the Pacific Northwest. She is biracial and grew up with her non-Black parent. Her narrative suggests that she grew up in an environment where race wasn't necessarily something that was discussed. And her experiences were really along the lines of this Black emergent socialization. So she was really getting in touch with her Black identity as she got older and came to college. So while Hazel grew up somewhat romanticizing Black identity, she didn't have access to Black culture that would allow her to fully understand how to integrate that with her sense of self. She was excited to attend this particular university, which I'm calling Pacific Northwest University, because it was more diverse than where she had grown up. And she was also really excited to connect with other Black folks on this campus. And she says, when I first came here, it got to the point where being Black was my whole identity. So she went from this place of like not really knowing what it means to be Black to like the pendulum totally shift. And she was like all Black all day, all the time, but ultimately didn't know what to do with that experience and those feelings. She struggled in her interactions with Black peers because she always felt that she wasn't Black enough. And this internal conflict resulted in her buying into some of the negative stereotypes about Black culture and Black identity. She says, when you see things in the media about all these things that are happening to Black people, all these narratives that Black people have, and they were trying to perpetuate those on me, I didn't want to be that person. Hazel doesn't think that microaggressions are a real thing. She doesn't describe experiences that happen to her as being racially motivated. And she believes that sometimes Black folks make things more about race more than they should. And that's the perspective that she has. And she says, to be honest, I just want to be like another person. I don't want to even be seen as just a Black person. Yes, these are my characteristics, but I don't really want that to have much to do with who I am or the type of person that I am. I don't want to go back to the place where my whole identity was just being Black, because that in itself was toxic. Instead, Hazel focused on other aspects of her identity while downplaying her Black identity. She was an active student leader on campus and found community with non-Black folks. One wonders, however, how Hazel might have benefited from a more support and guidance from Black faculty or staff to help her unpack some of the challenges that she came up against when she was presented with some negative stereotypes about Black folks, and not internalizing those as being specifically about her or about all Black people in general. She was really buying into these ideas and not thinking critically about her own ideas in that space. So she really was in that earlier stage of self-authoring, right? She was more drawn upon like what everybody else was saying and not necessarily what she was believing for herself. The multicultural Negressen's profile describes a person who maintains a Black identity and strong connection to Blackness while being inclusive and open to other elements of their identity. So meet Raven. Raven describes herself as being mostly Black. She grew up in an environment where race wasn't necessarily a big priority in her family. And so when coming to college also was a time for her to kind of connect with her Black identity. She found her community on campus by connecting with students who shared her Christian faith. She describes her faith as one of the most important aspects of her identity. However, she also recognizes the intersections of how she identifies how she defines herself. So she said, I feel like an onion. I've got a lot of layers, and these layers are important to me being a whole onion. You can't just take one layer of me and say that that's it. It's not. I have to be the entire onion at all times. I don't want to be just a woman. I don't want to be just Black, and I don't want to be just Asian. I don't want to be these, I don't want these things to be separated. It's all important, and that has to do with many parts of my personality. I think I identify more heavily with these subsections as my whole now, as opposed to when I used to try to compartmentalize them. I finally realized that my identity cannot be compartmentalized that way. I want people to know that I'm a Black Asian woman. Now, Raven's narrative demonstrates a multicultural Negressen's profile in that she has found a way to integrate the many intersections of her identity while still maintaining a strong connection to her Black culture. This perspective also informs how she views her agency in the world. Now, she believes that race in some cases should not encumber a person's ability to achieve their goals in life, but also knows that it is a factor, right? She knows that the world is not always as fair to Black folks as other groups. She says, you can be successful and brown here at Pacific Northwest University because people are multifaceted. If it were just based on my color, that's not what's going to keep me from being successful. And I refuse to let it be the reason that I'm not progressing in the world in the way that I want to be. So in this example, we can see that Raven is drawing upon her multicultural identity to strengthen her resolve and seeks to use these different aspects of her identity to navigate the different situations that she finds herself on campus. Like those with multicultural profiles, people with bicultural profiles are able to maintain a strong sense of their Black identity while finding ways to fit within the dominant culture or a subculture, right? So Shanice grew up in a home with her Black parents in a small, predominantly white community in the Pacific Northwest. Her parents instilled pride in her Black identity and heritage in this environment. From a young age, Shanice knew that she was different from her peers, in part due to her race, but also due to her disabilities. She lives with cerebral palsy and frequent seizures. These aspects have become more a part of her identity. She says, recently I've noticed that my disabilities being a bigger part of how I define myself, but being African American, that's always been part of me. Now, she was eager to attend this university because of the diversity that it advertised, right? She found that upon arrival, things were actually different. She says, one of the most surprising things about PNWU is how it's less diverse than I expected. I guess I didn't expect to be the only Black person in the majority of my classes. So even though she was disappointed about this finding, she also said that she says, that's also how I grew up. I just thought that it would be different, so it didn't really affect me. Now, because of her familiarity with white spaces, Shanice was able to navigate the higher education environment with some level of ease. She connected early on with accessible education services and multicultural student services to make sure that she had the supports that she needed to be successful on campus. When asked if she feels like she fits in at the university, her response was mixed. She says, yes, because I'm able to stay on top of everything I need to get done, and no, because looking around, I don't see many people who look like me. Now, Shanice credits her Black friends on campus for providing a sense of belonging and supporting her persistence, right? So again, we see that the connection with other Black people plays a critical role. So perhaps the combination of growing up in an environment that really valued race and talked about it in a positive way helped her have some resilience navigating this predominantly white space. But then also growing up in an environment where she already had to navigate white spaces because of where she lived allowed her to develop the skills and cultural capital to successfully navigate the campus environment. Well, this is the last profile I'm going to share with you. So I've put on a continuum those with Black nationalist and that first internalized racism negrescence type would be on complete opposite ends. So Black nationalists are people whose Black identity is the most important part of who they are. So if you were to ask them, tell me about yourself, one of the first things they would say is, I'm Black. And I'm really proud of that. And that is kind of how it's a really quick way to kind of identify where a person falls within this continuum. So meet Andre. Andre grew up in the American South in an environment where race was very prominent and was talked about and discussed. So in addition to being Black, he describes himself as being an artist, Southern, and Christian. Andre is astutely aware of the ways in which racism impacts his life and mobility as a Black person. He explained that he is very intentional about the types of spaces that he enters to avoid racist encounters. And this is on campus, off campus, everywhere. But having a strong sense of what he needed to kind of fulfill his core as a Black person helped him quickly identify resources and people that affirmed his Black identity. So he found work with a nonprofit organization that engaged in advocacy campaigns for Black communities in the area, and then also got involved with Black student organization on campus. One of the things that was interesting that Andre shared was he was very wary of white instructors due to some bad experiences that he had on campus. And he says, I'm going to be 100% honest. I don't want to have any more white instructors at PNWU, period. So deciding on which classes to enroll in involved an additional layer of work and research for Andre. And I can also tell you that Black folks do this when they are looking for work as well, trying to get a sense of, is it safe for me to work here? Are there people that look like me in this organization? So what Andre does in terms of school is he talks with his peers in the Black Student Union. He looks up professors online to find out which instructors are safe. And above all, he avoids taking courses with white instructors. For Andre, being a Black student at the university is all encompassing. He explained, from what classes I take to what major I'm in, to what spaces I put myself in, to who I trust. All of these factors are informed by his racialized existence as a Black person. As such, he's dedicated time and energy into navigating the experiences to avoid discrimination while creating fulfilling bonds with other Black people on campus. I think that Andre's strong connection to his Black identity aided him in helping him find the types of people that would affirm who he is and helped support his success at the institution. And in just a moment, we're gonna discuss some of this. But I wanted to show you a little bit of a model that I created to help us understand how these different negrescence types interact within the campus climate. So those with internalized racism will usually have an easier time navigating white spaces because they're not necessarily thinking about how race is impacting their experience in the way that the other groups do. So they may assimilate with the white campus in order to fit in. However, their resistance to be associated with Black identity will continue to be challenged in the environment, and they'll need support to unpack that racial trauma. Students with multicultural or bicultural negrescence types are going to have an easier time navigating campus, but benefit from strong ties with other Black people for support and guidance. And I should also know, I should have added another bullet under internalized racism. They also need Black people, but they need Black folks who are equipped to help them unpack that trauma in a way that, because it is trauma, right? There's some psychologically embedded things there that need to be worked out. Finally, racially hostile campus climates pose the most challenges for those with Black nationalist negrescence type. So folks with this identity are deeply aware and troubled by racism in their lives, and they're more likely to isolate and not be their full selves on campus. That said, their passion to disrupt systems of oppression butts against the white hegemony of higher education, the structures and the culture, which can lead to their disenfranchisement. And they often are the ones who are going to depart from your organization faster or your institution faster because this place is not for me. I'm not getting what I need here as a whole person. But one of the advantages of these folks with this identity is that they have some of the best insights for social change. These are the folks that you can go to and say, what is wrong here? And they will tell you, you need to do X, Y, Z, this, and they have really great perspective on how to best support all Black folks, because that is kind of the main piece of their identity. All right, I'm going to take a pause here and ask if anybody has any questions or if anything came up in the chat box.
People feel welcome to raise your hand too, but there are a few comments and questions in the chat. And Tressa says, at the U of O, for instance, is there course offerings or orientations for incoming students in a safe place? In other words, a sanctuary type class for BIPOC and a course or orientation for white students to address some of the challenges BIPOC students experience? I wish there had been something like that for me 50 years ago when I went to college as a white student, with college being my first experience with diversity. BIPOC were tasked with navigating being my edutainment as I began my journey as an ally. I would like to hear a little bit more from Tressa, but do you have any comments on that, Doctor?
Initial thoughts. So the University of Oregon, which was not the site for this study, but they are in the process of building orientation programs for different affinity groups, right? So there's now a Black Cultural Center, which just opened on campus. And so that center is doing a lot of the work to create a safe and welcoming space for Black students to help them navigate what it means to go to college and to go to college as a Black person. There are also different scholarship programs and honors programs for different affinity groups. And so there is some of that happening, but it's not able to meet the needs of any student that needs it, right? The resources are limited in that respect. And then the other piece that I appreciate your comment about edutainment, right, is not putting Black students in the position to have to speak on behalf of their people, right? They are not necessarily, it's not fair to put that burden on them to educate their white peers in that way. And so I want institutions to be very mindful and organizations to be mindful to not push Black people into a corner and have to be the ones to do all of that work. There's lots of resources and things out there to help you learn about Black culture, Black identity, Black history that doesn't add this additional tax on Black folks to have to do that, in addition to navigating this environment that already is not welcoming for them.
I also wanted to ask a question in addition to that. I live in Medford in Southern Oregon and work for Medford School District. And we have 13 positions that have just now opened for assistant principals. Now, Southern Oregon has is notorious for being an unwelcoming environment for persons of color. And we have a diversity desert going on in our teaching staff. And I'm on the EDI committee for our district, serving on the Black and African American committee. And one of the things we've been talking about is how we need to support our BIPOC students with instructors who are of color. How do you propose that we could possibly make anyone want to come to join our community in Southern Oregon? How do we support our Black educators to come into our valley and experience the growth of this area? What's in place to support educators or building community in the state of Oregon, where it's so red politically outside of metropolitan areas? I know that I know that we white folk have to work on our own people, and I'm thinking that in addition to the education of accurate Black history, we've got to have some courses for white students that deal with their white fragility and orient them to diversity. I'm just throwing that out there, guys.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I want to open, we are going to talk more about like, what do we do about this in this next section. But yes, that is a huge challenge. It's something that we struggle with at the University of Oregon as well, is how do we get folks, I work at the Portland campus, but in Eugene, like how do we get Black instructors and faculty and staff to come and stay at the university when there is not the wraparound community support that is really important for their success, not just at work, but beyond, right? And that is a nut that I think we have not cracked yet. And so I'm hoping that we can open the floor to some ideas from other folks in this room about what may work. I can say just personally from my own lived experience, I am biracial. I grew up with my white mom. And so I have been able to successfully navigate white spaces because of that lived experience, right? And so moving to Medford, I'd be like, oh my gosh, I know Medford. I grew up in Oregon, as Sherman said. Moving to Medford would be, I would definitely think about like, where am I going to get my hair done? Where am I going to get the foods? My family's from West Africa. Where am I going to get the foods that I need so I can kind of carry on those cultural traditions with my kids? Are my kids going to be respected in the schools by the teachers? Are their histories going to be represented? And so these are the kinds of things that need to start being put into place before people get there, as much as we possibly can. And that is a huge, huge problem. That recruitment and retention piece is challenging. It's not that there are not Black professionals to fill those positions. It's that the environment that we're asking them to go into is not conducive to their success. And so organizationally, there's some things that we're going to need to work on in that respect. But I want to keep us moving because I know I've got a little bit more to talk about.
Has her hand up. So
okay.
Why don't you ask for yourself, Jonna?
Oh, sure. I just had a quick question about the negrescence model. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about whether in the original framework or through the research that you did, if there was discussion about how people are perceived, how they're perceived racially, if that impacts their progression and I guess development in their Black identity. Just really curious about that, like how that external perception can influence those stages that they may be in, either depending on just what they even look like.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the development of these negrescence types is based on the encounters that people have in a lot of cases, right? So we know that there is, for darker skinned Black folks, they are perceived as more dangerous and more threatening, particularly Black men. Darker Black women are seen as more aggressive if they're sharing their insights. They're not allowed to have the same level of emotion. They have to kind of censor themselves in ways that lighter skinned Black folks may not. So yes, I do think that I'm trying to think of the folks study. I mean, it was a smaller sample, so I don't want to extrapolate and say like, oh yes, this is the trend that I'm seeing. But I think that based on the fact that we know that encounters shape how we define ourselves, and knowing that that folks of different shades of Black have different types of experiences. Often, if you're darker, your experiences are worse than if you are lighter. I think it certainly does play into kind of where they might fall within those negrescence types, but I don't have the data to be able to back up that. It's more anecdotal.
Someone said I had another comment, but I'll let the moderator step back in.
Yeah, I mean, this might be something, Sarah, that you're going to address, but I just wanted to say that in the chat, there is a lot of question and discussion about how do you reach students or professionals who have limited exposure to racial diversity and inclusion, or I'm colorblind, or politically I feel like this stuff is kind of a waste of my time and I can't like focus on this and feel like this is an important class to take about inclusion issues. I mean, these are the questions, right? How do we get people to understand other people's lived experiences, I guess, to paraphrase. Hopefully that's not incorrect.
Yeah, and I think that's a challenge that we face, not just in higher education, but in like the training and development realm of workplace change, right, around equity and inclusion, is how do we help people understand that there are humans that are having these lived experiences and we should care. And that's really frustrating, I think, from my perspective, is like, people should care. And how do we get them to care about this stuff? And so some ways of doing that is sharing lived experiences like I have with you, of these students and what they have gone through, right? And so that is one way to connect, right? There's also, I know Sherman has some different activities that he has suggested in his work to help people connect across culture, around commonalities that may not necessarily be culture related, but like, what size shoe do you wear? And then have a conversation. Like, we all wear the same size shoes, but we all have different lived experiences. So I think it's initially the first piece is, let's start having a conversation with each other, break through that silence. I think it's harder for folks who, like, I would say, traditional age college students right now are much better at having these conversations than folks who are older, right? And so I think there's a lot of like worry and about like, oh my gosh, how are we gonna do this? They are so woke, particularly with instructors. I'm like, let them lead the conversation. It is okay to take a step back and be a facilitator of this stuff and allow the students to talk with each other and wrestle with these tough ideas. Because ultimately they're going to be the ones that are going to have to continue doing this work when all of us are gone. So creating that space and empowering them to have these conversations and say, I really just don't get this. I'm Black, this was not my experience. And allowing them to sit with that, right? And having other Black students or other folks with different identities saying, well, this actually has been my experience. So, what else might be happening here? What other factors are there? Also looking at history, also looking at economic trends. Also, like, we're not making this stuff up. It is embedded in the history and culture of this country. And so I think part of it is also taking a stand and just saying these things happen and we are going to need to work through this together. And not all folks are going to want to hear that. And so we just kind of have to pick our battles.
And you have another segment. So Shauna, do you mind waiting till the end to ask another question?
Oh, I didn't have any more. That was it.
Okay. Okay. And that's it in the chat.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk about implications, and most of these are based on higher education, the higher education environment. So in order to address a lot of the challenges that we're seeing among Black students and how they're navigating higher education, the system of higher education. It's not an individual problem, it's the system's problem that is creating these disparities in Black student success in higher education. We need to look at what's happening from different levels, right? So individual, organizational, and systemic, and I'm going to describe those right now. So from an individual level, this is where we have to do a lot of work, right? So particularly for white folks, will need to put in work to educate themselves and take more responsibility to how their actions may perpetuate white supremacy. There's lots of resources on this. I'd suggest first starting to look into works about white fragility and anti-racism, which is a bit more advanced, to kind of understand how these things have been socialized in a way that we often behave, not necessarily that we're bad people, right? We're not individually bad people, but we have been kind of over time trained to believe certain things as true, and that informs the way that we interact with others. And so I suggest, coming to sessions like these is a great start to kind of open your eyes to different ways of knowing, but then not just stopping with attending, right? Trying to do something. And often what I hear from folks when they're learning about a new identity, or like not even just like with Black folks, but like trying to interact with using like the correct pronouns with LGBT folks, right? Is this hesitance, like, I don't want to mess up, I don't want to do it wrong. There's this really strong need to be perfect. I want us to get away from this idea that we need to be perfect. We are never going to be perfect. This is a growth process. It is never going to end. Our goal is growth, right? So if you make mistakes, apologize and do better next time. Like, it's not the end of the world. Some of the things that I encourage faculty to do is consider adding anti-racist statements on their syllabus. This is the document that students get when they are taking a class, and goes through kind of the course expectations and things like that. That can send a strong message to the class that we are really going to be looking at things from a critical perspective. One of the units on my campus right now is actually going through a process of creating anti-racist personal statements. So this is where they are really deconstructing how they have come to learn about racism and where they sit within society in terms of their gender and race and sexual orientation and class, and thinking about how all of those things impact how they engage with racist processes. And so that group has had some really powerful insights through that process. In terms of your courses, having Black voices in your courses, and I always tell people, like, don't just bring a Black person to talk about diversity. Students need to see other representations of Black excellence, right? So if you're doing something with accounting, bring a Black accountant to come talk about their experiences, because we can talk about more, and students need to see Black folks talking about more than just diversity, right? And then some of the things that are really helpful from an adult learning perspective is allowing folks to choose content that connects with their identity. That means they're going to connect more with what they're learning. So if you're doing a diversity training in the workplace, kind of having folks choose from a variety of different categories to explore, and then perhaps connecting those experiences with a racial experience, right? So you can have folks read articles or watch a video on class, mental health, gender, and then make some parallels to racism, right? So that allows people who may be resistant to talk about race or to apply similar concepts to race, the opportunity to feel more of a connection to those discussions. I'm gonna keep popping through these real quick. Organizationally, institutions need to take a hard look at their mission statements, and organizations as well. Most of them include a statement about valuing diversity. But when we look at the retention rates and success rates of Black students in higher education, when we look at the retention rates of Black employees, when we look at the levels, like where Black folks are situated within the leadership of organizations, we're failing in a lot of these missions, right? And so really taking a hard look and saying, are we really walking the walk or walking the talk or whatever that is? Like, just really making sure that there's alignment between what we're saying and what we're actually doing. For all of the participants in my study, they said that more Black faculty, students, and staff could make a huge difference in their experience. But bringing more Black people to campus is just part of the equation, right? Or bringing more Black people into the workforce is just part of the equation. You need an environment that actually values and supports their retention. And so I have some ideas about that, which I can talk about in a bit. But that are specific to higher education, but from a critical race lens, looking at your recruiting practices, your reward systems. In higher ed, we have promotion and tenure, looking at the way that your budget is allocated to support different employee resource groups. All of this can tell us a lot about your commitment, right? People put their money, they invest their money where they think it's going to have an impact. And oftentimes it is not put in places that are meant to enhance and retain diversity. And then from a systemic lens is really looking at critical race theory and using that as a guide to help us understand how things have come to be within organizations and how we can deconstruct them. Acknowledging that racism is permanent and pervasive. It means recognizing that the intersections of identity can result in compounding harm. So Black women experience more harm because of their positionality as being Black and a woman are often undervalued in American society. This involves interrogating ideas around meritocracy and colorblindness, particularly like, well, if you just work hard enough, it'll be like you can succeed and anybody can succeed in this organization. Well, that's not necessarily true if the practice is to hire and promote from within. And it's really often kind of like the good old boys that are constantly being put into these positions of power. And as somebody noted in the chat, I'm able to see it now, talking about color blindness. Color blindness is something that we talk about in critical race theory a lot, in part because the practice for a long time was, well, we're colorblind, right? And so I don't see race. Well, that's actually more harmful than actually talking about race, because it ignores the lived experiences that people of color have, and kind of glosses over that. And it means that we're not paying attention to the things that we need to change. So that has been a big shift, particularly from the 1980s onward, that we're now shifting. And so millennials will often be more likely to call out racism when they see it. And folks from like the baby boomer generation are more likely to say, oh, I don't want to talk about race. I don't want to go there. And so we see these ideals butt up against each other in the workforce. And I think it also, let's see, where am I here? We also need to kind of get away from this idea that the problems that we're seeing in society are based on like the individual acts that people are doing. Like we can't, like racism, yes, racism happens, microaggressions happen, but we are not going to be able to change those unless we address the structures, right? We're looking at the policies, we're looking at the practices, we're looking at the norms and expectations, because that is where this stuff is embedded. One of the things that I'm saying in a lot of my meetings right now with groups where we are looking at organizational culture is we are done picking low-hanging fruit. Like you can do a diversity training and check off that box. We can have a mission statement that says that you appreciate diversity, but unless you're actually doing the work to hold people accountable, to make sure that those expectations are clear, you are not going to see the change that you want to see. Because they are structurally embedded, and we cannot. And I may ruffle some feathers with this, but I'm also of the opinion that we're kind of at the point where people aren't going to change out of the goodness of their own hearts anymore. I worked in public health for a while, and one of the main pieces that I learned from that work is policy informs behavior, right? So unless we have some policies in place to kind of disrupt these practices, we're not necessarily going to see the change that we want to see. All right, so those are the main things that I wanted to talk about. I've got some discussion questions here that we can use to launch off with, and I know that I promised Sherman that I wasn't going to run us out of time without having more time for discussion at the end. So I hope folks can stick around and continue to talk. But yes.
I'm completely available to be here and host this meeting for as long. I just feel like there's so much inspiration coming out of what you've talked about and a lot of interest. So I'm excited to hear more discussion, and we can stay as long as we want.
Perfect. What questions do we have in the chat? Did anything come through while I was talking?
I think just reiterating what Rafe said, you know, these organizations do include our schools and our unions, as has already kind of been talked about a little bit. And we need to, you know, as mostly, well, hopefully our unions are our most democratic institutions that we have direct influence over. You know, we should be getting involved in making sure we're not just, you know, putting out mission statements and then not following up on them. I really agree with that. And that's a really small but important thing that I as an individual can do. There's not a lot I can do as an individual, but I think that's a really important one. Is being in my union.
You have two hands, so that's the two hands giving them opportunity to be heard. Colin.
I didn't see who went first. Did you just call on Colin?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, hi, thank you. My name is Colin Moore. I'm with the NALC Branch 82 here locally in Portland, Oregon, National Association of Letter Carriers. So I'm with the post office, and I belong to a HWI, which is, I'm learning that acronym now, which is great. I'm in a union that was segregated until the 60s. And, you know, with what was going on this summer, you know, there's so much space and education to talk about, you know, the harm of segregation and the harm of, you know, the Jim Crow era of this, you know, that we're still living through. And unfortunately, in my union, the faces of leadership reflect that. And, what is the most effective language to bring, you know, into the union hall to talk to, because this is a white issue that whites need to clean up. That's how I see it. And, you know, and I'm trying to come to my branch and I'm talking to not this audience, I'm talking to a much different audience. And so, you know, it's always helpful to get like, you know, perspective, you know, from, you know, you guys as to how workers talk to each other in this environment. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And that's really a complicated one. And I think it's a reason why things don't change as quickly is because the guidance is not exactly clear about how best to go about it. You've got charismatic folks that are able to kind of get in and build relationships and start moving things forward. I'm wondering, Sherman, based on your experience or your thoughts or anybody else who's in here, what has been effective, right, to bring this stuff to the fore? In higher education, we do a lot of workshops and things like this. We have a lot of committees that are working on this work. I mean, there's a committee, a diversity committee basically for every group. And those are successful to varying degrees.
So just to kind of help you out there, Sarah, as we're kind of thinking through the process of what's the mission of organized labor? And a lot of it rests on the ability to get folks to volunteer to join the union. And through that process, build power. We've kind of witnessed over the last year the Black Lives Matter movement and how organizations came together to address some specific societal challenges. Well, those challenges also are represented in the workforce, and especially, you know, organized labor has struggled with equity and inclusion. And so the language, as I've kind of been doing outreach with these groups, is to kind of get them to think critically about the voice that's heard and what's their permanent interest. You know, our job moves beyond just bread and butter issues, but we're now moving in an area where we want to look at what's good for society. So we're not just bargaining pensions and wages, but we're also now trying to affect change in the broader society where workers' rights have been oppressed, just like folks of color. And so we have to kind of find the language that supports our mission as unionists. So there's another question.
Howdy, y'all. My name's Ralph. I teach at Portland Community College and I'm a proud member of Portland Community College Federation of Faculty and Academic Professionals Union. And the whole discussion today, I just loved your approach, Sarah, to this lens, and bringing it in on Black students in particular resonated with me, and my experiences seeing, these are this like labor questions are in my mind because of the way this session was organized. I'm thinking of times that like a white faculty member and union member is racially problematic, is expressing discriminatory views to either colleagues or students or both. And then when a complaint comes about their behavior, that racially problematic union member can bring the grievance and get the representation of the union. Like our structure is designed to defend our members for whatever they get in trouble for. And this is the kind of critical question that I want to ask any union member anywhere. Colin brought it up in a formerly segregated union. It's obvious, but even at a union in a place where every statement from our college, every statement from our union is about supporting diversity and inclusion, but our policies don't do that, and our structure doesn't provide for it. So just hearing, putting the view right on students helps me also like expand that out into the faculty and into the staff. And I really appreciate your lens. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you so much. This is the first time that I've kind of had to extrapolate it beyond higher ed. And so it's a little shaky, and I am grateful that Sherman is here to provide that extra insight. But yeah, there's definitely that application. And sometimes that's the power of kind of looking outside of the box at something. We get so ingrained in kind of, well, this is what we do with an organization, with our people. But if you kind of look at a different scenario, that can be really powerful for uncovering how norms and things may be perpetuated within your own organizational culture, within your own union's practices. Sure.
Well, just to jump in here a bit more, Sarah. When we think about what is reasonable and unreasonable behavior, and we think about the role organized labor play through the grievance process, well, in most due process language, the goal is rehabilitation and corrections, right? And whether or not this person that's the subject of this case has a mindset that would allow those involved to prescribe a way that they critically think about how their behavior, discriminatory behavior, racist behavior, etc., violates the spirit of we're all in this together. And traditionally, unions say, hey, listen, which is the current debate right now with the trial that the jury has been selected for in George Floyd, that behavior has to be one that is conducive to everybody having a sense of safety. And two, union's role is not to necessarily protect that behavior. And traditionally, it's kind of become more complicated because that's the way folks interpret solidarity on some sense. And, you know, I'm not from that school of thought. I was actually the head of a union. And periodically you get those cases that, you know, it's too extreme. And so the Duty of Fair Representation Act and our duty of fair representation does not necessarily mean we have to protect that type of behavior if in fact the person involved does not necessarily have a willingness to change. And that's how I would address that issue.
Thank you, Sherman. Any other thoughts or things folks would like to share?
I had thought I'm not familiar with labor unions at all. I'm also a higher ed professional, so I'll just put that disclaimer out there first. But I just wonder, as I was hearing about the the way that the approach is to address certain issues, rehabilitation, and what was the other part? Rehabilitation and another
Corrective measures.
Corrective measures.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's space in that philosophy for restorative practices, and maybe if adding that as an additional approach or expanding that view to include more of that language, more of those types of practice could also be helpful, because those restorative practices typically focus on the person who's been harmed, or who's alleging that they've been harmed or in some way. And so maybe there's room for that to be incorporated somehow into the approaches or philosophy of the union strategies. Just a thought. I have no idea, but just a thought.
No, I appreciate the thought. And for me, I'm one that when I do these trainings, and definitely we don't want to keep everybody here much longer because we want to respect folks' time. But restorative justice type of work, I think, is applicable for workshops. And I think, in particularly, we're dealing with adults. And so this level of accountability and the role that organizations have to create the kind of cultural competencies that's needed for folks to get a deeper understanding of how we foster a sense of belonging. And oftentimes, because people are not as familiar with unions, and this is part of our racial justice series, like we want folks to understand the role of the unions as advocates, the role of the unions as in creating justice, right? That's kind of we fight the civil rights movement, et cetera, for a form of political and economic justice. But that also means we have to create the model for a broader view of interpreting how justice becomes operationalized. So I think, yes, in trainings, we could also take components of the restorative justice curriculum to address some of these adult challenges with race, gender exceptions, bias, etc.